Welcome to the Hidden Bookcase. Come through and get cozy. Pick a book, your favourite book, that's the one that opens this room. Inside you'll find a warm fire, a loving cat, and a wide skylight to the stars.
And a dangerously high to be read pile.
I'm Morgan, I use they them pronouns, and I am tortoise number 4.
I'm Sorren, I use he him pronouns, and I am tortoise number 3.
And I'm Kit, I use he him pronouns, and I am tortoise number 2.
Sorren and I have been friends for over a decade, and the two of us are always swapping books.
Each episode, the two of us, sometimes with help from a friend, take it in turns to recommend one another a favourite read. The first time reader tells us what they know about the book, makes some predictions about what they don't, and then we discuss our thoughts with all of you bookworms. For Ahistorical Autumn, we're reading alternate history books.
So today let's get to talking about
The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley. So we're joined today by someone very special, who you've kind of been listening to this whole time without even knowing it.
Whoa. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Hi, I'm Kit. I am one of the editors for Hidden Bookcase, and I've been badgering Morgan about coming on the show since it started.
And also Sam on the Attic Monologues, if you happen to know Kit as a long-suffering roommate.
Yes. If you vaguely recognise my voice, that's probably where.
And how did you guys... You met at uni, right?
Yeah.
The two of you met at uni.
We met for a mutual friend at a D&D party. In fact, we met at a D&D social event because my friend went, oh, Kit, you went to go see the mechanisms. Here's Morgan. Morgan likes the mechanisms, which is possibly the most me way to meet someone.
Well, specifically, I was doing this like D&D one-shots night, and the DM, when he was supposed to be doing like a very sort of like spooky alien-sounding thing, he used a quote from the Bifrost incident, and he was like, Yog so thoughtful, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, that sounds familiar. Do you perchance partake in the mechanisms, perhaps? And he was like, you need to talk to Kit right now. Yeah, and then the pandemic shut everything down, and I was like, oh my god, this really cool person I met, I'm just never going to be friends with him ever again. And then I joined Podcast Society in second year and was like, it's you!
It's me! We definitely rebonded over PodSoc. Also it being like the pandemic, and there's those very specific kind of like Zoom friendships where it's like, we haven't met in person in several months, but also you're like one of my closest friends now.
Though Kit and I have only met in person once, we have conspired against Morgan for a while to read a Natasha Pulley book on the show.
Well, I've been asking you to do it for ages, and then we kept just not finding time, and I own like 4 of this woman's books at this point, and I hadn't read a single one.
Too many themes. And then we picked the one that you didn't own, didn't we?
I had to go out and buy it.
I'm so sorry.
I did obtain it.
Listen, it just made the most sense.
You're supporting Natasha Pulley, though.
Yes.
That's true.
This is true. And I have a feeling I will be rereading this book multiple times because, I'm going to be so honest, I'm not entirely sure what happened in it.
I'll be honest, this is my 3rd reread, I think, or 4th, and I still don't know what happens.
Acknowledging that, Kit, do you want to give us a brief summary of what this book is about?
I can certainly try. A surprisingly simple premise, which is a man named Joe wakes up one day, gets off a train and realises he has completely lost his memory, and that he is standing in the middle of London, which has become essentially a French colony. All the writing is in French, all the signs are in French, but Joe has lost all his memories. The only link he has to his past is the name Madeline and a postcard that gets delivered to him that has been apparently held in a sorting office for about 90 years, directing him to the Aileen Moor Lighthouse. So when a job opens up on said lighthouse, Joe drops everything to travel there and discover the truth about his past. And also time travel.
And also time travel.
And also tortoises.
And also tortoises. Beautiful. Should we find out what Morgan thought it was about?
I am so excited to hear this.
Okay, so things I know about the Kingdoms. I know it's gay. I know it's alternate history. I think there's something to do with like water or sea or lighthouses. Like, I feel like I've seen that on the cover. For context, I do not have a copy of the book, so I'm just going on vibes. I know Sorren's wants to do it for ages. Something, I think, about French colonialism, maybe? I feel like that's been brought up as a theme. But other than that, I have no idea. I'm very excited to see what this book is about, because honestly, no clue.
Honestly, I can't own you more about this book than I've known about any book beforehand, I think.
I mean, in fairness, doing it for alternate history autumn does kind of reveal to you that it involves alternate history. So
I fully realised I didn't actually mention what the alternate history event was earlier. So if you've managed to get this far through and you haven't read the book, basically the English lost the Battle of Trafalgar, and it all went downhill from there.
The big L.
The big L. Which, as someone who had a book about Horatio Nelson as a kid, was very fun.
my historical knowledge is not great, so it took me a while initially to figure out that it was the Battle of Trafalgar.
I just assumed vibes. I was like, at some point things change. I'm sure they do. My grasp on history is almost as bad as my grasp on geography.
This is one of like 7 kind of periods of history, TM, where I like have a weirdly in-depth knowledge about weirdly specific things. And it's mostly because I read a lot of Regency era stuff. So you kind of have to have a base knowledge of the Napoleonic Wars were happening at this point. This is the thing I always kept forgetting when I was reading this. This is like peak Jane Austen time.
Yeah, that's happening in a different corner of the country, I guess.
Because it's such a like violent book, it's so divorced from all the like Bridgerton, like, you know, Lex Croucher romances.
I mean, that's also like a class thing, definitely.
Yeah, although I mean, a lot of the like characters are really well off. Jem is a member of the House of Lords, which I feel like doesn't get like kind of really resolved.
Yeah, we don't get much about Jem's parents in that life, which is interesting. I was kind of thinking I'd forgotten about it, and then on the reread I was like, oh no, we actually just don't really find any of this out. We don't even find out about his first wife and his child, really.
His first wife, Madeline. So we get her from the letters.
But I mean how they met or anything.
Yeah, we don't know what his actual honest-to-God surname is, because he tells Kite and Agatha that his name is Castlereagh, and then later is like, oh, that's my mother's maiden name, so like you don't need to worry about anyone tracking down my relatives. Which, by the way, presumably also the Castlereaghs are a famous family?
He specifically says that they wouldn't like him if they knew his actual surname. So that's probably the issue, rather than it being well known.
Well, I'm wondering if it's because Jem is very much implied to be, like, white passing, whereas his brother isn't necessarily, and then at least in the iteration of the future, the second last one that we get, his father is alive, and he knows that he's Chinese, and he's explicitly aware of that, so it could be that surname.
Is that definitely his dad, or is that his adopted dad?
I got the impression that that was his actual father, because they call him vaguely East Asian when he's a slave.
Yeah.
And he's never really sure.
Okay. I think I missed that part, and I was imagining him as, like, vaguely black. I don't know
I mean,
why.
to be fair, they say that he's very just sort of, like, difficult to pin down.
I think there's a phrase, and it's something like a few shades too healthy or a few shades too dark to be native or something. It's a really weird way of saying this guy doesn't have completely beige skin.
Yeah. No, I think he is Chinese, and I think that the reason that Kite reacts the way that he does when they meet, and he gets his surname, and he's like, there's a line of, where he's, Joe, I guess, is explaining that he's sort of clinging to it as if it might be taken away from him. I think it's because that was previously sort of a bit of vulnerability that he didn't actually get from Jem, and now he's found this out so easily. Because I'm kind of assuming that your parents stay the same, or else you just don't exist. Because I feel like this is interesting because it does sort of imply a sort of soulmatism that's flowing through time, because otherwise how did they meet if the circumstances were so different? But I feel like it kind of has to make the plot work.
Because also the thing that also confuses me is when he has the third iteration of himself, he never goes back to being nobility.
Yes. But I'm assuming that's because too much has changed, because the French already had, like, telegrams and warships and all of that from the kingdoms. So all he did was gave some of that to the English side, which then meant that the English did not lose the Napoleonic Wars, but things had already changed to an extent that, like, technology had come along further than it was supposed to, if you like.
One of the things I found really interesting is in that last chapter when he's talking about things that are different, he says something about, like, the churches aren't electric anymore. Because there's a bit really early on where he says, oh, it's really easy to light a candle for, like, religious reasons. You just put a penny in the slot. Which, by the way, is also quite a nice little touch of the Frenchness, because that's a very Catholic thing, is lighting the candles. Obviously, they would put lots of money into doing that, whereas that's not a thing we have today for Anglican churches.
You know what, I didn't even pick up on that because, like, all of my Christianity experience is from my Irish side, so it is, in fact, from Catholic. So I'm just like, yeah, that's normal, that's how churches work. But I don't go to churches in England, so...
Weirdly, I pick up on it also because of my Irish side, but because it's a few steps back.
Yeah.
So whenever we go to a Catholic church, Mum is like, oh, I'm going to make an effort to light a candle for, it's like my great aunt or someone. But yeah, I thought that was a really nice little bit of world building. And I'm almost sad it didn't continue. I feel like electric churches sound sick as hell.
Yeah, I like the tidbit about the electric halo.
Yeah! Like, that's such an amazing image. A throwaway sentence about, like, wow, shame we don't have those anymore. And I'm like, why not? That sounds awesome. But again, I guess that is tying into the compositive because, like, images of the Madonna aren't really a thing. It would be more like a kind of a crucifix with a, like, electric Jesus, which, again, would be cool as hell.
I mean, Pulley has studied history, and you can very much see that. Like, the depth in those little attention to details in terms of how things are different.
One of the other things I thought was really interesting was the way that Jem/Jo keeps forgetting stuff, and then we as the audience, she never like signposts things for the audience, but you kind of, if you're paying attention, you can kind of keep up with it. And the thing that always gets me is first time we meet Kite in the lighthouse, and then Jo, because he goes back through the pillars, forgets that he's done that, and then meets Kite again, and it's not signposted as like, wow, there was something really familiar. It's just like really like, this guy appeared with a scar on his face, and you're like, wait, hang on, we've already met him though, haven't we?
There's no narrative voice that's establishing that this is the same guy. You just pick up on the fact that it's the same guy.
Dramatic irony.
It certainly doesn't help with the confusion, but I think is kind of cool. It's a very fine line to tread where like you could go really hard the other way and like really over-explain everything, and that would just get really annoying really quickly.
I think it's important to keep everything rooted in Jo, at least up until we start getting flashes of Kite's point of view, because otherwise I feel like you would just lose the...
And of Agatha as well.
I think that's where I began to lose it, to be perfectly honest. When we started getting other points of view, and it wasn't entirely signposted because I was listening to the audiobook, so it took me a lot of time to figure out when things were happening and what was happening, and I never really did, to be honest. This book kind of slid off me quite a lot. Really enjoyed the beginning, and I really enjoyed the final sequence. The 80% from when he first leaves the lighthouse, the first time that we see, up to literally when Kite comes to visit him when he's in the third timeline. Like, the whole middle of this book, I could not tell you a single thing that happens, to be perfectly honest.
I feel like what doesn't help is it's a lot of action scenes, which I have a thing with, like, if it's really action heavy, it just goes completely over my head. I think I just kind of like skim through stuff. And a lot of the middle section is like naval battles and like running away from the French, people getting imprisoned and broken back out of prison.
Yeah. Like, I didn't know Agatha was dead until it was said on text, and his sister had already died. And I was like, when did she die?
It's a really blink and you'll miss it thing. It's literally like she gets hit with a cannonball, and it's like this one sentence where it's like Agatha dissolved.
Turn to mist or something. It is quite subtle.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time of phrase, because it's not she got hit with a cannonball, it's literally like she dissolved into a red mist.
Jo does comment afterwards, oh, Agatha was on the way to murder her brother when she died.
Yeah, that's when I learned that she was dead.
I read this as prose both times, and I feel like I would have really struggled with it as an audiobook, to be honest.
Yeah.
I'm very curious to hear everyone's opinions on Kite, because I feel like I'm so confused as to how I feel about Kite, so I want to know.
I don't know what my feelings on Kite are, and it confuses and scares me. You definitely get the idea that, like, if he had lived... And, like, that's the irony with Kite never getting to do the, like, alternate history thing.
Exactly.
If he had been allowed to live a different life, he could have been a very different person, compared to Jo, who's basically the same guy in every iteration, which is quite interesting, like, as a kind of character foil thing.
And especially, I think, because Jo, he keeps saying, oh, I'm the same person, but I feel like him being the same person kind of comes back to Kite, like, he's revolving around Kite like a planet in his orbit. Like, he, at one point, he refers to himself as being through the school of stoicness or something via Kite.
Yeah.
I think when he's looking at the pocket watch that has a bomb in it and pretending that he doesn't know that it's rigged up.
I was reading this the most recent time. I was like, I would actually kind of love to see this as a TV adaptation.
Honestly, same. I think it would be so strong.
Like a BBC 3-episode miniseries.
It would be such a BBC miniseries. It has BBC miniseries written all over it. BBC, get on it.
I really enjoyed Kite as a character from what I grasped of him, because he contained multitudes. He's at once the hardened soldier, but also, like, would not be that if he hadn't been pushed in that direction. And that was interesting to me, especially because we got him from so many points of view. He seemed the most interesting. I did not like Jo.
Oh, really?
He was so wishy-washy. Every 5 seconds he was like, I'm going to turn Kite in for murder. I'm going to do it. And he's like, no, but I can't, because something in me says I can't. And then he does, and then he doesn't, and then he does, and then he doesn't. And he's just like flip-flopping back and forth like a fish. And it's like, there's this other book I read recently that I can't mention because it is an SMP title. But in that book, there are these two characters who meet. They've met before, but the main character doesn't remember this. And the character who meets them goes, this is the least impressive version of you I've ever met. And it's basically like, you've always had a god complex, but this is the first time you haven't also had the power to back it up.
Oh!
Which is very entertaining to read. But that's what this reminded me of. All the other versions of you are more interesting. They've got more spine. They've got more character. And this man feels like he's just on the page to flip-flop about and not do it. Like, he's not driving the narrative in any way that's, like, meaningful.
Like, ironically, we're getting the worst possible Joe out of the three we're shown to be a main character.
Exactly!
We're not getting the headstrong House of Lords member. He's had, essentially, to him, his whole life being an actual slave. And so he's got that kind of, like, I've accepted my fate, especially when you compare him to Alice in the bad timeline.
Yeah. Like, it could be interesting. He could, as a character, be interesting in the fact that he's so wishy-washy, but what he came off to me as instead was just sort of stagnating, and I was like, I'm interested in all of the Kite flashbacks. These are interesting to me. And the Agatha flashback, that's kind of interesting. And then we got back to Joe, and I was like, can you make a decision? Kiss the man or don't? But don't keep saying you're going to turn him in for murder. Don't keep saying you're going to turn him for murder. Just do it or don't.
At least he does.
Move on. Yeah, he does. And then he's like, oh no, but actually I regret it. I'm going to punch someone in the face about it.
At least you punched someone in the face about it.
Yeah, but...
The one thing I did like about Joe is the consistent through line of him being a dad. When he's on the boat and he keeps seeing all the really little children. The bit that got me was the bit where the two kids are scraping sand across the deck, and it's like one of them draws a little smiley face in the sand and giggles.
That was a good moment.
He's noticing that because he has that perspective that the others on the ship don't necessarily have. He multiple times is like, these kids are basically the same age as Lily, or like, these kids are only a little bit older than Lily.
I'm going to say something controversial.
Say it, Morgan.
Lily did not feel like an emotional hook.
Oh.
She felt very distant from the whole narrative. It felt like she was supposed to be haunting the narrative, but at the end of the day, I never felt like she was there. I felt like she was this idea in Joe's head that he was like, oh, I should probably get back to her. But she wasn't haunting the narrative.
I wonder if she'd been a little bit old.
I was literally about to say that. For the timeline to work, she had to be that age, but I think you're right, Kit. I think if she had been older, she would have had more of a personality, and therefore it would have been easier to understand Joe missing her.
Yeah, I connected more to his new daughter in like 2 pages than I did to Lily at all.
Lily was cute because she was like a little baby and she made up magic animals. But then you meet Beatrix, and Beatrix is like, oh, she's very little and she's already developing this complex about not being paid attention to. And you're like, oh, God, okay, yep, fair enough. That's always going to hit harder than happy, healthy baby vibing, talking about flying cow, nearly getting crushed by heavy machinery.
See, I don't emotionally connect to a baby just because it's a baby. I need there to be a personality. I need there to be something for me to hook onto, especially in a narrative.
Honestly, I think that did work for me, especially because it was like, she'll be with Alice and Alice won't give her that kind of attention. Not because Alice is like a bad person. That worked for me. But I do think it kind of falls by the wayside just because so much is going on.
Yeah.
I do think that it's, as Kit was saying, a good through line in terms of Joe is very like hyper aware of the children around him. He connects to Fred on this kind of like paternal level.
Yeah, I definitely did get that through line, and especially with like Fred and how he treats him. Definitely saw that.
After a point, it definitely does become, Lily starts becoming a, I need to get back to Lily, and not just a, things are reminding me of my child. And that, I think that's when it almost, I'm using this term because it is like a like legit term, almost sexy lamp. But like adorable baby lamp.
I agree. I think at the beginning it's better because you get things like, oh, Alice won't be embroidering ducks on her nightgown, and he's like watching the other sailors sew, but then later on it just becomes Lily, and there's no like elaboration there of like, how old would she be now if time is passing normally back home? What if I come back and then 10 years have passed? I mean, obviously there's the worry that she won't exist at all, but it feels like there could be a whole spiral of related worries there.
I feel like they could have really lent on the, what if I come back and she doesn't exist at all? Because he keeps being like, oh, I need to go back and save my daughter just because I need to go back and save my daughter, and not, I need to go back and make sure that my daughter still exists because I'm mucking around with a time stream in such a way.
To be fair, I do think he's kind of in denial about that, because even when he gets brought to Edinburgh Castle and they're talking about the telegram, and then they say, oh, well, we've already done this and this, and then he goes, okay, it's already changed, it's too late. But then he goes, well, I can't. I think it's sort of like a matter of survivability at that point, where he's like, well, I just can't like reconcile the fact that my daughter may not exist, so I'm just going to act like she does.
Which is objectively a horrifying concept. Like, you have these memories of people that no longer exist.
Healthy and hale a second ago and now in this timeline aren't.
That moment where at the end, where he's like, yeah, okay, I'm going to go with Kite because Alice will look after the kids and everything will be fine. And then he wakes up the next morning and the house is empty. That got me. On a reread, I didn't realise it starts before he even goes to bed, because he makes a comment about someone's taken down all the decorations already. And I'm like, oh, that's not them taking it down, that's them disappearing. That's good.
Yeah. I thought it was a little bit convenient, oh man, the only thing that's keeping me here are these kids. Oh, wait a minute, they don't have parents. Cool, kids, free child, baby.
Yeah, the fact that he'd already decided to leave, I think, convinced me. I feel like that was a very important incident for him to realise that actually the safest place for the kids would be in the past, because if he leaves them here, they probably won't exist anyway. So I think that was good.
Yeah. I wonder if it's also a bit of a lack of closure with Lily, because you have these two new kids who come in, and then it's like, well, what about Lily? And then he sort of congeals into his one singular self, and it's quite like an upbeat ending, which I understand, but at the same time you have just lost your son and your daughter, and if you remember them both now, and your brother and his wife / your wife, depending. I would have loved to have a moment where he remembers Agatha's death through that new light of, oh, she was my wife and I loved her and she was blown apart in front of me, and it didn't hit me at the time because I didn't know who she was, and now I remember her.
I've literally never thought of it like that she was legit his wife and she got killed.
That is really fun on a reread, though, watching Agatha engaging with Jo and knowing that, she is seeing Jem's face every time she's speaking to Jo. It, colours all of her actions. It's really interesting.
The scene when Fred remembers, rereading that is horrible because you know what happens next. Pulley gives you just enough time to fall back in love with him on a reread. Oh yeah, Fred, he's such a sweet kid. Oh god, okay.
It was very, it's supposed to be obvious that Jo and Jem are the same person, right? Because that was very obvious from the off.
It was to me as well.
I'm thick, so I didn't get it.
Don't say that. But when did you get it, if you remember?
When they were by the way, you're Jo. I think it was there was a Kite flashback where he explicitly says Jo is Jem, and I went, oh, that's what's going on. Genuinely don't remember working it out. Certainly on a reread, I could spot it a few moments, but it wasn't as clear to me as I think it might have been to others.
I think it just explains everything about Kite. All of his actions to Jo. I think that's why I liked Kite so much, because I was connecting with him emotionally. Because I love a good angst where you have to protect the other person or protect yourself by lying to them. I love that. I eat it up. So the whole time I was like, oh my god, Kite is going through so much. I just want to give him a hug.
Another one that's so tragic on a reread, because you get that lighthouse scene and they're so cute and happy together and having such a sweet little date essentially. And Jo's out here wow, I'm sleeping so well next to you. And Kite's okay, you have to go. And then he goes and immediately forgets. Yeah. And then Kite's there I tried to let you go. And Jo's what are you talking about? I've never met you in my life. And it's no.
You know what made me laugh on a reread was all the bits where Jo's man, that one night in the lighthouse must have been wild.
Yeah, he's putting everything on that one meeting because he knows that it happened, and it's no. No,
you guys were fully... So that was also something that was slightly confusing to me, was so when he was still Jem, him and Kite didn't have an actual relationship. It was just kind of they both clearly had feelings for each other, but Jem was married to Agatha.
They made out on the train down.
They did make out on the train down, but that was kind of the only time it kind of became...
They kissed at the party, and there was the discussion about sharing a hammock that then Kite pulled away from. I feel possibly, and they're good, this is reader's interpretation a bit, I think that maybe there was some, physical relationship going on, but then Kite wasn't letting himself be emotionally involved because he was this is my sister's husband, so I can't. And thinking, oh, well, he doesn't want anything more from me than that. Because there are a lot of, casual references to, all of the gay sex going on in the Navy.
The reunion, when Nelson shows up and they have that little reunion party on the ship, which again, really sad rereading.
But there, yeah, exactly, because they say, oh, are we sharing a bunk? And Kite says no. And then Jo says, well, what do you mean I haven't seen you in 2 years? In a way that he was expecting it to happen.
See, I read that as just kind of we're such good mate that we'll share a bunk together.
It could also be that.
I literally no homoed it.
Fellas, is it gay to tattoo this random man every time you meet him?
I love that.
Is it gay?
Not in the Navy. Weird stuff happens at sea.
I love when they're like, sorry, it was a psychological emergency. I needed to mark him to feel power over my situation. And Kite's like, yeah, that's good. That works for me. I know I met this guy like 2 days ago, but it's fine. So heterosexual.
Meanwhile, that moment where Joe is like, you've just like imprinted Jem onto me, get your perverted crush away from me and grow up. Just stab me with a butter knife, it would hurt less.
Random internalized homophobia, just lashing out. I don't know. It was horrible. I hated it.
And that's interesting as well, because that's a version of Joe that he's been a lot more like repressed, and he's much less comfortable and confident in himself. Whereas Jem seems kind of like happy to flirt back with Kite and not worried about it, and that's... Ugh.
I wonder if it's a difference between Madeline and Alice. That Madeline seems like a pretty chill person and like actively trying to make herself like she like. There's a whole thing where she's like, oh, I'm really hyper aware of the fact that I'm upper class and these unlike the other people aren't. Whereas Alice is like, my husband doesn't want to have sex with me. I'm going to take him to a priest because clearly that's the problem and not the fact that he's gay.
I think it's also the fact that like Jem is from nobility and is very aware of who he is, whereas Joe has no history. Joe is just living on a whim and a prayer.
Yeah, and literally a slave with like a history of like sexual assault against him.
Exactly.
Implied from his master as well.
That was a really weird bit where he was talking about like, you had to do it because she's your wife.
And it's interesting that he has that knee-jerk reaction around Agatha as well, who used to be his wife, although he didn't quite remember.
Yeah.
When she's, like, in his space. And then he was like, oh, it was the thing with Alice, where, like, when women get too close to me, I get nervous. And he doesn't have, like, normal healthy boundaries. There's that situation where Kite's in the bath and Joe's talking to him.
Yeah, which I didn't pick up on. I was like, oh, that's a, like, weird, like, quirky thing for a guy. Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah. And the master's, like... language with him as well is very like fetishistic, and he's always talking about like how beautiful he is and all of that stuff.
Deeply uncomfortable.
It's a kind of almost character trope of the kind of like upper class, slightly like bumbling, but secretly a bit creepy, like especially to people who are in a lower position of power to you, but he's so polite about it.
I think it was well written because like Joe as a character doesn't see anything wrong with it, but you as the audience are very much able to see that this whole situation is very, very bad, even though Joe is going, oh yeah, you know, that's just my master, he just does these things, yada 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 yada. It's very much a show not tell, which I think is pulled off really well.
Yeah, and I think that works throughout, which is interesting in terms of if Joe was a slave who was like, oh, but I want British freedom, I feel like it wouldn't work as well, whereas he's like, I don't really care, and he's got all of this like propaganda that's been shoved down his throat about how the English are like backward and savage. He keeps thinking disparaging things about the English because he's like, well, I don't even really identify as English.
Mild spoilers for the Mars house. They do exactly the same thing with the English language in that, because basically the plot is Mars has become a Chinese colony, but it's also kind of like vaguely Russian. And English is basically considered a rude language to speak. One of the reasons being English is a gendered language, and it's considered rude to call people like Mr. and Mrs. But the main character is a refugee from England. And it's got exactly the same thing with like this weird kind of like internalized being funny about speaking your own language. Language is really, really important in Mars House. And I think you can kind of see the beginnings of it in Kingdoms when Joe's constantly like, it feels wrong to hear English spoken with a posh accent. He constantly keeps feeling like he should be telling people to stop speaking English.
I thought that was really interesting as well. I really enjoyed that inclusion.
Yeah. Flipping the like situations on English colonialism.
Yeah, I think Pulley is always very aware of language. I think I've noticed that with the Watchmaker series as well.
I feel like the girl from Oxford in Watchmaker, who I apologise for not remembering her and Agatha have incredibly similar vibes.
I feel like Pulley has like a little bit of a type of like, ruthless female characters, and I really like it. And I want more of them.
It's very I support women's wrongs. They're both people who've had to marry someone. Sorry, Morgan's mild spoiler. But they're both people who've had to marry someone, not necessarily because they love them, but because it's advantageous to them in their position as women.
That someone might be homosexually devoted to their soulmate and not that interested in them.
See, I'm like, yeah, that sounds like a good arrangement. Go forth.
Pulley has a real thing for like vaguely lavender marriages. It's great. And then Mars House is literally about a fake marriage, but not for those reasons. It's a cool trope to play with, I think.
It's interesting because I've actually heard a lot of criticism about Pulley's writing of women, and fine, of what I've read, I don't usually take the spotlight, but I feel like she writes good female characters in my opinion, even if they are not the point of view characters.
She definitely writes really interesting. And none of her characters feel like one note or stereotypical. they're not necessarily likeable, I think is the difference. Like, I don't think Agatha is a likeable character. I think she's an interesting character.
Yeah, like I enjoyed her point of view, but would I want to hang out with her? No.
God, absolutely not.
To be fair, I don't know if I want to hang out with any.
Would I want to be her younger brother? Christ, no. But again, like, we've been robbed of seeing an alternate universe Agatha.
Exactly.
Where, like, she didn't have to be that ruthless. Let her be, like, a dance mum or something.
Oh my god, can you imagine Kite in his little ballerina slippers or something? Oh dear. But yeah, no, absolutely, because Agatha never really wanted to do all of that to Kite. She was just invested in his survival, and so invested in his survival, in fact, that she did not take the easy way out and just go to England and leave him. She could easily have done that. She was like a teenager.
Yeah, she could have lived the life of, like, a lady of luxury. The bit that really got to me was the bit where they're on the ship and she, like, holds his head and makes him watch the guy dying, and there's something like even she didn't want to be looking at it, like even she wanted to turn away or like close her eyes.
Oh, that bit. Also, the bit that gets to me is during the actual attack on London. He gets that massive injury, the burn, and she takes him into the cabin and they're having this conversation, and at one point she says something like, you know, just like put it together. And then the narration says he smiled as if she'd said something kind.
Oh.
I think that's such a good encapsulation of their relationship. Who are people's favourite characters? I know we've kind of talked about characters a bit.
See, before Morgan talked about how wishy-washy a character he was, I was going to say Jem.
You can still say Jem.
/ Joe.
You can say Jem. Also, Jem is different to Joe, in my opinion. They are very different characters.
I wish we'd had more time with Jem.
I empathise with that.
Which, in the BBC miniseries, which I am adapting right now, we will. Can you just imagine an entire flashback episode? It'd be so good. Anyway, I was kind of drawn to Joe because I feel like the kind of everymanness of him makes him a little bit easier to kind of... I know, like, book characters shouldn't have to be relatable to be good book characters, but there's a certain aspect of, like, I could kind of see myself making his decisions, which I think was quite compelling.
I mean, he's a very realistic character. I'm not slagging him off as, like, a bad character. I'm slagging him off as a personally I find him very annoying character. But I think he's well written.
The problem is sometimes the realistic choice is kind of a bit of a boring one, or is a bit of a kind of, like, panicky one. And that's why, you know, book characters don't necessarily have to be relatable and realistic, because sometimes it's more entertaining when they're, like, Kite and, like, 4 layers deep under repression.
I feel similarly in terms of, I think Joe is very believable, and I felt rooted enough in his narrative that I felt like I enjoyed him, but I did enjoy him more when he was in his villain era, when he was doing things that were a bit more Jem, when those bits of him were shining through. Like when he got a bit ruthless.
I loved the scene with the bomb, where he was, like, having to sit there looking at a ticking bomb and pretend he didn't know what it was.
Exactly. Ugh.
And he managed to, like, nat 20 deception, like, get his way out of that one.
I was thinking that. I was like, he's a charisma build. Everyone who sees him is like, he's so beautiful. Like, when he gets the carriage as well, and he just flirts with that guy.
There's one line where he's like, he'd forgotten how charming his smile was because it didn't work on Kite.
And the only reason it doesn't work on Kite is because he's in love with you.
Yeah. It's like when TV shows do the thing with, like, oh, one character gets a spell cast on them so that everyone falls in love with them. And there's one character who isn't reacting. And it's like, wow, the love spell must not have worked on you. And they're like, actually, secretly, I've been in love with you the whole time, and this is just my normal.
That's my secret. I'm always in love with you. But yeah, so I remember on my first read, like, any time we got a Jem flashback, I was like, yes! And then we go back to Joe, and I'll be like, okay.
I also liked Fred. I think he was just sweet.
Fred is fun. Fred is an ADHD legend to me.
Yes. ADHD autistic legend. I love the bit where he's stroking Joe and Kite has to go, what did I tell you about not touching people you're not related to or dating? And then, like, Joe falls over and catches Kite. And Fred's like, but you're not married to him.
They might as well be. Ugh, that bit at the very beginning as well, where he's like, everyone's carved their wives' names into this rock, and he sees his own name, he sees Jem.
Oof.
Oh, that was a really good, like, thing being seeded early on and then brought back in a new light, which I think with time travel narratives is one of my favourite things, where you see something early on and then you later see the event that led up to it. Like, in the greatest time travel movie of all time, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I will stand by this. There's an amazing sequence where they're trying to break into a police station. There's a cassette tape that a future version of them has recorded and says, right, now walk over here. Now wait 2 seconds, and a bin falls on someone's head because one of them later goes back in time and sets this bin up to fall. And it's brilliant. To me, that's what you should use time travel for, is mucking around with things being set up in the past and then being brought back and given new meaning.
Well, like in a book we recently did, This Is How You Lose the Time War.
Ooh, did they do that in that?
Oh yeah. There's the specific character who shows up throughout the narrative and you think you know who they are, and then you find out who they actually are. And it just changes everything.
It's very satisfying when it's pulled off well. And I think I'm so fussy about my time travel, and I feel like some of this hurts my brain in terms of our tortoises. The cause and effect thing.
Those tortoises don't make sense.
I think it's the only way for the narrative to work, right? Like, you can't be worried about Joe disappearing from existence in the past when which kind of doesn't make sense, but you just sort of have to go along with it. Like, I think it's a good rule.
It's like, I don't know if you guys have seen one of the new episodes of Doctor Who that came out recently, when they do the stepping on the butterfly thing, and then the Doctor runs back inside the TARDIS and goes, oh, I forgot to turn that switch. And he turns that switch, and that's letting the audience know, hey, you don't need to worry about the whole stepping on butterflies thing.
I am less fussy about my time travel than most because I, as a teenager, went through the hell that is the DC TV shows where they contradict their own time travel rules within a single episode, and then they have different time travel rules for different shows which are set in the same universe.
I get really geeky about time travel rules. I think it's a very fun thought experiment.
In The Flash, it's a closed circuit, so things that have happened have always happened.
That's my favourite kind of time travel. And although I know that isn't how Kingdoms work, but I think Kingdoms does non-closed butterfly effect time travel better than others.
I agree with that, yeah. Closed circuit is also usually my favourite, but I think that this does a good job with what it's doing.
Closed circuit, as seen in the greatest time travel movie of all time, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Because I feel like if you do alternate timeline stuff, because this wasn't technically alternate timeline, because I think the implication is the old timelines completely disappear. I think in Doctor Who you can go between parallel universes, and those universes still exist.
I feel like with stuff like Marvel, it can often be like a too many cooks situation.
Yeah.
Definitely.
With this, you can tell, if you've read the acknowledgements, you can tell that Pulley was like losing her mind over this, but I think that just because it was her, she figured it out.
Yeah. Yeah, the joy of like writing a novel versus writing a TV show, and also making it such a self-contained book.
Yes, I think this wouldn't work if you tried to write a sequel.
No, this was definitely like, I'm going to do this one book, nothing has to contradict it. Mars House has cameos, essentially, from Watchmaker.
Oh, there you go.
Has a reference to the Maury company. But this doesn't. This is completely its own thing.
God damn, that guy is everywhere.
I love that guy so much.
So my favourite character...
Oh God, we were talking about that, weren't we?
I think I'm really biased, and my favourite character is Agatha. As somebody who has a girl boss, ruthless, kind of terrible woman named Agatha in their own show, I was just wholesale pasting one over the other and was like, yeah, this makes sense. They are the same person.
For those listening who may not know, we are referring to Morgan's very cool show, The Attic Monologues, which we referred to earlier briefly because Kit is also in it.
Woo.
If you imagine Agatha as a arsonist who was briefly involved in a cult and is now making the cult leader suffer by still existing and making it his issues at every available turn, she will punch him in the face for fun. It's very entertaining. She is super tragic if you think about her too long, but we don't yet.
I feel like if you put Kingdom's Agatha in the Attic Monologues, she would make almost the exact same decision.
Oh, totally. She would deck Raven on the spot.
So, you just love women's wrongs.
I mean, I have a brand on this podcast at this point. I support women's wrongs, almost always. And even if I don't support them, I can probably be talked around after 5 minutes. So, I was imagining her in, like, petticoats and then, like, work boots, just sort of storming around ships, which was very entertaining to me.
Sorren, who was your favourite character?
I love Jem. I do enjoy Joe, even though I like him more when he's being unhinged.
You support Jem's wrongs.
I support Jem's wrongs. I support Agatha's wrongs. I do love Agatha. I feel like I have to mention Kite. The first time when I read this, when he committed child murder, I was in denial for like 3 chapters. I was like, we're going to find out that Joe did not see what he thought he saw somehow.
Fred's fine.
Yeah, I was like, Fred's fine. Or maybe the wave took him, or I don't know what I thought. And then I eventually had to sort of come to terms with it, which I think was good because it's such a sudden moment. And then Joe is also in that state of like, did I really just see that?
Pulley does a really good thing of like having really intense things happen in the heat of battle and having the characters react realistically to that, like Kite shooting the guy and just moving on, or like Agatha dying is one sentence and then Joe has to move on. He literally has to go off and do something else and he can't dwell on it. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at war and looking at battle. Like, you really can't dwell on things.
That poor child that gets their arm blown off and then is like, can you please cauterize this so that I can go back up there and keep fighting, please? And then Agatha's like, okay.
That bit cut me to the quick.
Damn.
If you haven't guessed, I don't like it when bad things happen to kids in books.
I feel like if that was a deal breaker for you, this book would like be impossible to read, and I understand why it would be for people because it is pretty brutal.
I think that she does toe the line with it. I think she does very well, like keeping it realistic and being like, yeah, this is not a safe place for kids, and yet obviously this would have happened. It never feels like gratuitous.
But no, I completely agree with that. I think it's like the toll of violence rather than violence for violence sake. Particularly in that moment where you see Joe has just seen all of this happen because it's literally right after they break the blockade. And then Agatha's uncle finds out that she's died, attacks Kite. And then Joe is really horrified by that, even though he's just seen all of this violence because he's like, well, this is so personal and you're just going for somebody who's not fighting back.
It really encapsulates their history of like, Kite just sits by and lets this happen to him. And Joe's like, I've seen this guy in combat. He wouldn't take that from anyone else.
Oh, but yes, Kite, I don't know. I'm always a little bit of a sucker for like a shy, quite vulnerable character who is putting up a veneer of like aggression and violence. So I do love that about Kite. Joe's protectiveness over Kite, like that dynamic, I really like because it would be so easy to write it the other way. And I think Pulley does this quite a lot with her like relationships where it never feels like, oh, here's the big strong one and the like shrinking Violet. Like it doesn't go the way you would expect it to go in terms of how the dynamic works, and I really appreciate that about them.
There's a lot of like comfort and a lot of like being there for each other in a lot of her relationships in a way that I think never feels like it's a weird dynamic. It just feels like this is what people in love are like.
I'm going to say that they have a weird dynamic and I like it. Jem specifically is like, I'm going to chain you in my closet. That's flirting for them, and I love that for them. I'm like, good for you guys. But I feel like you would expect it to be the other way around because Kite's the pirate captain here. But because it's not like that, it feels fresher, which I appreciate because it is Kite that technically kidnaps Jem like 3 times.
There's a bit where he like rests his gun against Joe's knee, and then there's like a scene change or a chapter change. I genuinely thought he'd blown Joe's knee out. I think Joe makes a reference about wanting to, like, he's going to escape or he's going to go back home, and Kite just like puts his gun there, which again would look amazing in the BBC miniseries that I'm going to commission.
Do we want to do quotes really quickly before we jump into final thoughts?
I have like one quote, which is the first line. I just think it's a really good first line. I think it does a really good job of like establishing the vibe of the book.
I was struck by the first line as well. It's, most people have trouble recalling their first memory because they have to stretch for it, like trying to touch their toes, but Joe didn't. This was because it was a memory formed a week after his 43rd birthday.
I love that.
Such a clear example of what this book is going to be like. And there's something about the metaphor of having to stretch for it, like touching your toes. It's something that's not necessarily impossible, but something that takes a bit of effort, and it takes more effort depending on who you are, and like the older you get, it takes more effort.
It's very nice. I feel like Pulley is beautiful with those little metaphors that you wouldn't exactly expect. One that's sillier, but is used to describe the person who they turn up to claim the bounty when they deliver Kite. A discombobulated daddy longlegs. There was an urge to be careful with him, but also to throw him out the window. She does that a lot with like little descriptions for people that are so funny and so like, how would you even think of that? But also it's perfect and it gives you such a clear image in your brain immediately.
I've just found another one of those, which is talking about Joe and Toby's father. He pretended that he didn't speak English, although Joe had noticed there was a distinct correlation between his English abilities and the increased potential of mince pies. I have never met this man before in this entire novel, and this is the last chapter, and yet I have the most solid like image of what this guy is like.
Exactly. That's kind of the only thing you get about him as well, and honestly, that's all you need to know.
It's literally all we know about this guy. He likes mince pies and he doesn't like speaking English, and honestly, he's valid on both counts.
I really like this bit from when he figures out that the postcard is from Kite instead of Madeline. And just the description, the same egg white horror which had slid down his spine that day at the Gare du Roi was back again now.
Egg white horror.
Egg white horror sliding down your spine. I get it. I hate it. I get it.
It's such a visceral sensory thing if you've ever had to handle egg whites in your life.
On a completely different note, but one I feel like I would be remiss not to mention, I've missed you even when I didn't remember you. Gets me every time.
I love it. I eat it up.
To circle back, but that moment where he does realise it's Kite's handwriting, I think that might have been where I realised that there was something up.
That makes sense.
That the M was for Missouri and not for Madeleine. Madeleine's another really interesting character.
Madeleine is such a good character, yeah.
I think she does a better, haunting the narrative than Lily.
Well, you get to know more of her personality, and then also she's obviously the one that designed the thing that nearly kills Joe later, which is also a fun callback.
Also, to tie back in with the time travelling thing, the thing I thought was brilliant was that's how the French catch them out, is through tube station.
Yes! Oh my god, I can't believe we haven't brought this up yet. I'm so glad you did.
Because, okay, so there is a housing estate in Exeter that is, all the roads are named something to do with Nelson or Trafalgar. They're all Victory Close or Trafalgar Lane. And it's all these little things that, if you were talking to, a spy, or if you're talking to, a person in the past, you don't think twice about why Waterloo is called Waterloo.
And then that connection that, they would never have named it after a battle they lost, and they would never have named it after some place that isn't relevant at all at the moment. So there must have been something fought there, and they must have won.
It really reminds me of, spy novels, where it's even if you think you're giving the most innocuous information to someone, that can be turned against you. It's almost the reverse Sherlock Holmes. When it's in, Sherlock Holmes books, it's he can take all these weird little details about someone and build this bigger picture. Imagine how horrifying that would be if you actually did have something to hide, and it was being turned against you, and your enemy is bloody clever.
Such a good moment.
That French general, was just such a cool character.
And I like that continuing thread of, he could be being worse. He could just be torturing them.
And also, I think he knows that he could get information out of them by torturing them, but he can get useful, correct information out of them by just being patient. At this point, he kind of has all the time in the world. The French weren't in an awful position pre-Trafalgar. It's not like they're super on the ropes and absolutely desperate for intel. This is just a kind of I reckon we can get something interesting out of these guys.
Can absolutely afford to play the long game.
Yeah, I think says a lot about Pulley and the amount of historical research she's put in. No pun intended, but she's picked her battles very well.
Okay, I feel like we have to wrap up on that note. Morgan, you're the new reader. Tell us what you thought of The Kingdoms.
I think I will really enjoy it on a reread.
How was it on a first read, though?
I was looking around trying to find summaries of the book, and I was very close to just going, okay, guys, at the beginning of this recording, can you just tell me what actually happened in this book?
I've read it 3 times and I still don't know.
It just completely slid off me. 80% of the middle. Really loved the ending. Really got me. And I think on a reread, when I understand what's going on, I will really, really enjoy it. And I'll appreciate it. But on a first read, especially as an audiobook...
I almost wish I'd told you not to.
Oh, no, I would have audiobooked it anyway.
No, I was kind of thinking you wouldn't listen to me when I said it. But I can empathise. I remember that I put in my review the first time I read it that it made my brain feel like scrambled eggs.
Which is the thing, I really love books that scramble my brain. I am a Harry the Ninth enjoyer. But crucially, that book is deliberately gaslighting you.
I think this book is also kind of deliberately lying to you.
Yeah, but it feels a lot more purposeful in Harrow. It all slots into place in that sudden moment, whereas I feel like this doesn't have a slotting moment. It has okay, I understand some of what's happened now, but I still don't know what happened in the action.
It has several small slotting moments that still leave a few gaps.
Yeah. So I think on a reread, I will really enjoy it. This is not slagging off the audiobook. The narrator of the audiobook, very good. I liked his voices a lot. This book is just slightly too obscure for that. And he didn't quite differentiate his male voices enough, which, considering how many male characters there are in this book, I didn't know when it was Kite narrating, I didn't know when it was Jem, I didn't know when it was Joe, I didn't know who was narrating when, or what timeline we were in when, because it wasn't obvious.
If you missed those little chapter headings, because I didn't necessarily pay attention to dates when I was first reading it, and so I was like, wait, when are we? What's going on? How many years earlier? And, obviously, if you read the bit where it says the 1890, then you can work it out, but I didn't.
Yeah, and also I think if you're listening, you can't refer back easily. If you're reading it and you go, hang on, where are we? Then you can flick back a page and go, okay, there we are, and continue. But if you're listening, that's not possible, which makes it much more difficult.
That is why I went out and bought a copy, and I nearly didn't start the audiobook properly until after I'd bought the book, because I was like, I am lost. And then I was like, I'm just going to muscle it out and it will be fine. But I feel like having the physical book would have helped a lot, because I could have referred back and been like, okay, that chapter is in this timeline. Cool.
Kit, what are your thoughts?
So I have a weird thing with Natasha Pulley books, where the first time I read them, I remember absolutely devouring them, speeding through them, and then every time I reread them, I'm like, yeah, it's a book. I don't know what it is. It's like, because I remember when I first read them being like, yeah, I'm super excited to do this as Hidden Bookcases. And then I just keep rereading them being like, yeah, it's alright.
Damn.
It has some really cool things, and I think it does what it does really well, which is a similar thing that I think Evelyn Hardcastle, for all its faults, does well. It's introducing concepts that are very common in sci-fi fantasy to literary. This is not a book that is put in the sci-fi fantasy section.
Which is wild.
I know, but I think it works quite well as a kind of like introduction to time travel literature.
Yeah, I think anyone who enjoys historical fiction would probably enjoy this, even if they don't usually enjoy sci-fi.
I think in a way that you might not necessarily leap to something like a Doctor Who episode that happens to be set in the past. But yeah, I think the characters are really interesting, but I think the jumping around a bit with the plot breaks my brain a little bit, and I will never find out what was up with those talks.
Sorren, what about you?
I really loved this. I think it held up well on a reread for me. I was kind of nervous because I read it in 2022 in like one day, in like a mad fugue state. I think I followed this. I definitely got a little bit more confused the first time. I felt like I remembered it well enough this time to feel completely at ease with what was going on. And particularly because of the tortoise thing, I do think it's actually quite a good way of demonstrating how the rules work, so you don't end up tripping over yourself on terms of like, well, if Joe's done this in the past, then he shouldn't exist in the future, so how has he got back to the past?
I was fine with it until someone said, but wait a minute, how did he know to bring the tortoises? Or how did he know to be there if the tortoises never existed?
Yeah, based on the intention, if you haven't done it.
Yeah, if the tortoises never existed, why did he know to come? And then that broke me, and now I can't stop thinking about it.
But they did exist in the end. He didn't shoot all of them.
Yeah, I'm slightly confused as to how they can exist in two places at once, but we'll get yeah.
I think that's just you have to accept that one, which personally I was fine with, but I can understand why it would.
I'm a Doctor Who fan. I've accepted weirder things in the name of time travel.
But yes, love the characters. I like how Pulley is very happy to write extremely morally grey characters without trying to convince you that they're good people, that they're just interesting people. And I think that's something that she consistently does really well, that I really enjoy. So, love that. And I like the world building. Joe's mixed racedness, I think she did a really good job with that, as someone who, as far as I'm aware, does not come from that experience. I'm pretty confident for Pulley. But she does her research. I think that's something that is obvious in this book and in all of her books. So I think she executed well on that. What do we have to recommend to people that enjoyed The Kingdoms?
Everyone should go read A Marvellous Light by Freya Marske.
Yeah, you should. It's great.
Some more Achillean historical fantasy.
Tell you what, if you're just looking for historical fantasy without necessarily the time travel aspect, or just historical fiction, KJ Charles is my absolute go-to for historical fiction. She's an incredible writer. She started self-published, so a lot of her books are like £2 on Kindle, but her last few books she's actually published as physical like copies that you can get in like Waterstones, which is wild to me. And she has a series called The Sins of the City, which is a murder mystery in Victorian England. First protagonist of the first book is also mixed race. He's half Indian. And there's some really, really interesting stuff about how that works. The whole thing really heavily revolves around parenthood and illegitimacy and like lines of succession, which sounds really dry when I'm saying it like that, but is exactly my kind of like the stuff I absolutely eat up with a spoon in historical fiction.
Good source of drama.
But yeah, if you like the mystery elements of this and also you want more gay historical romance, KJ Charles.
We've mentioned them already, but I would definitely recommend the Watchmaker books. I have only read the first two at this point, but if you like Pulley's style and historical fantasy, then I think you will eat them up as well. And then I have a non-book recommendation. Shocking. I mean, this is actually based on a book, but I haven't read the book, so I don't feel comfortable recommending the books, and also I've been told that they're very different to the books. But the Netflix show Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency.
I have read the books. They are wildly different from the TV show.
As I've been told, yeah, exactly.
If you like Hitchhikers, read the books.
But for time travel that makes you lose your mind, but then comes together, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency.
This is another non-book recommendation, and it takes a while to get to it, so bear with me. But if you like time travel plots that deal with the fact that you are changing stuff in the past that could mean you're never born in the future, and grappling with that and the fact that you will be potentially losing everybody you love and possibly yourself, watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 7.
If you're listening to a Hidden Bookcase and you haven't watched Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., then we've recommended it so many times.
If you want to watch a character grapple with the fact that his parents are killed in front of him before he's born, go watch that and have fun. You will be devastated, but it's great.
Not necessarily time travel, but if you like the idea of small decisions branching off into different paths, read the Crestomancy series by Diana Wynne Jones. The idea is like you can travel between all these universes and the thing that splits them apart is like one small difference. And in fact, I believe in one of the universes it is stated that the English lost Trafalgar.
There you go.
Like, I think that is actually a plot point in Charmed Life, which is the one you should start with. It's great. Hey there, bookworms. Editing Kit here. Just jumping in to give another new recommendation. A week after we recorded this episode, I read The Ministry of Time by Callie-Anne Bradley. The Ministry of Time follows a government employee who gets hired as part of a time travel programme where people from various different periods of history are brought forward at the moment of their death to live out a new life in the 21st century. They are being kept under constant observation to see what the effects of time travel are on these people, and each are assigned a specific kind of carer. This book follows one person who is assigned one of the members of the ill-fated expedition to find the Northwest Passage. A man who basically was killed on that expedition was brought forward to the 21st century and is now kind of adapting to life in a new century. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of trying to work out what the government programme is actually for. Some very shady goings on behind the scenes. This is an excellent book if you like The Kingdom. It deals with the implications of people's decisions. It deals with kind of having to make very ruthless decisions in order for the greater good and what that can do to a person, the effect that that can have on a person. It's got some identity issues caused by time travel. Absolutely would recommend this book. It's recently been shortlisted for a bunch of awards. So yeah, go check it out.
Kit, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Where can people find you?
If you like my voice, you can listen to me on the Attic Monologues. You can also listen to me on the podcast To Chart a Well-Trod Course, which is a mini-series. I play one of the main characters, and Morgan's also in it.
Yes.
And Morgan's also in it, and it's extremely, I'm impartial. I was not involved in the production. I can say that it's really, really, really good. So we'll definitely put that in the show notes, and people should go listen to it because it's really cool, especially if you like agency in plotline.
If you like sci-fi and people who have committed horrible acts and have emotions about that.
Honestly, quite a good recommendation off the back of The Kingdoms.
Yeah.
So, before we continue on with Ahistorical Autumn, we actually have another episode, another fireside chat for you guys coming out later this month. As you may or may not know, August is Fat Liberation Month, which is an annual celebration of fat positivity, as well as an opportunity to talk about the discrimination and societal pressures imposed on fat people. We're very excited to be having Anya Josephs, author of young adult novel Queeneville, and also of a wonderful article in Reactor magazine about body positivity in young adult novels, on the show to talk about fat representation in speculative fiction.
So until then, you're always welcome through the bookcase.
Don't forget to switch the cat on your way out.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Bookcase, a production of Plain Art Prod. On this episode you heard Kit Lovick, Morgan Greensmith and Sorren Briarwood discussing The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley, with additional editing by Kit Lovick. You can find Pulley on Twitter at Natasha_Pulley, or visit her website at natashapulley.co.uk. A huge thank you to Kit for guesting on this episode. It was such a treat to finally have you on. You can find Kit at Sharpsmooter on Twitter, or you can hear him in urban fantasy horror show The Attic Monologues or sci-fi miniseries To Chart a Well-Trod Course, both available wherever you get your podcasts, and linked in the show notes. You can find The Hidden Bookcase on Twitter at Hidden Bookcase, and on Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr and TikTok at Hidden Bookcase Podcast. Find out more about Plain Art Prod at plainartprod.com. Know what we should read next, or want to chat to us about what you thought of this episode's read? You can reach us at thehiddenbookcase@gmail.com, send us a DM on social media, or come chat with your fellow bookworms in our growing Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Want to support The Hidden Bookcase? Support us on Patreon for bonus episodes, audio outtakes, playlists, and other extras. Buy a book through our bookshop.org page, or consider leaving us a rating or review or telling a friend how to find us. Your whispers are the best way for bookworms to discover our show. For our next episode, we'll be discussing fat representation in speculative fiction in celebration of Fat Liberation Month, alongside author of Queeneville, Anya Josephs. We hope to see you then, and in the meantime, you're always welcome through the bookcase.